And now we will hear from someone who worked at the Pentagon under two defense secretaries. Derek Chollet served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense, managing defense policy towards Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the Western Hemisphere. Today, he is the Executive Vice President and Senior Advisor for Security and Defense Policy at the German Marshall Fund. I should note that we're friends, so I can't hide that, Derek. That is such a thin read of your resume. What I need to tell everybody is he's had nearly every cool job in government, State Department, military, the White House. Let me just ask an unfair question on the front end of this. I have a lot of friends who served with you, who served previously, and they kind of pine today for the system and the world we had. They want to go back to a system where America was a trusted ally, where we were robust in NATO, where we did lots of things together, where we consulted, where there was a COVID-19 crisis, you would assemble the people around the world, the leaders around the world to deal with it. They want that back. I'm not sure we're going to go back. So my question to you, unfair, is you helped run policy planning at the State Department, did these things. Don't look back, look forward. Where can we go from where we are now to create a greater, safer, better national security set of choices for the country than we have today?
Well, Steve, first, it's great to be with you today. Congratulations on what has been a terrific session. I've tried to follow as many of them as I can, as I've been interrupted by other Zoom calls, but I really commend you and the Hill for doing this. Look, I think, first of all, it's very easy for us to have false nostalgia about the past, and the sense that there was this golden moment where everything was easy and the problems were very solvable, and the U.S. didn't have huge problems either abroad and at home. That said, we are at an extremely challenging moment. There are certain elements of this moment that, to me, aren't surprising. In fact, it was a moment that the previous administration was certainly trying to prepare for, whether it meant working to shore up our alliances, ensuring that our security posture around the world was as robust as it could be, but also building up the other elements of U.S. power, like diplomacy and development, which was a key priority. Of course, unfortunately, that's been rolled back to a large part in the last 3 years. So there's still a lot of good in what I guess we would call the old system, the alliances that were built in the post-World War II era that U.S. leaders of both political parties worked so hard to make so strong. But we do have to think very differently. We are in a totally different context now. This pandemic crisis is going to get worse before it gets better, I'm afraid to say. And many of those structures that previous U.S. presidents and leaders of both political parties helped build are very brittle. And they're going to, in some cases, need renewal, in some cases need massive reform, and in some cases we're going to need to build anew.
What do you think we need to do about China and its rise?
Well, China's rise has been one of the most important geopolitical shifts of the last, not just few years, but the last decade plus. And in fact, it was acknowledging the rise of China and understanding the profound geopolitical consequences of the rise of China. This is the reason why the Obama administration instituted what was known as the pivot or the rebalance towards Asia, to try to put more of our diplomatic, defense, and development bandwidth into the future challenges of the Asia Pacific, to build up our alliance structure in Asia, as Congressman Smith just mentioned in your previous interview. China is rising. China's military is developing in a way that it's seeking to undermine and counteract U.S. advantages. China is showing every day that it is going to throw its weight around diplomatically, economically. We've seen the way it's tried to take advantage of the COVID crisis, for example, in Europe and Latin America and Africa, to increase its leverage and increase its ability to assert its influence. So there's no question it's a huge, multifaceted challenge that is going to defy simple answers. And I think what worries me about the current China debate, and Steve, you alluded to it in your previous comment at the end of the interview with Congressman Smith, is that right now we're sort of having this very overly simplified, you're either a China hawk or you're a China dove, when in fact the reality and the sustainable approach to China is going to be somewhere in the middle. There's no question there's a military dimension to it. There's no question we got a lot of work to do to ensure that we can counteract and deter China from asserting its influence in Asia. But there's also a huge the diplomatic, economic, and development aspect to this as
Right.
well.
So I totally agree with you, and I worry about these binary choices out there. But I'm going to toss in, because we have Ross that just sent this in for you, and he said, should the U.S. be more aggressive in confronting Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea, which I find to be really important and very relevant, because in the last 24 hours, the State Department and Pentagon have sent signals that they're going to start hardening their response on a lot of these things. And I mean, you've simulated this. Where does that go?
The war games that I've been part of, or more of the ones that I've read about as well, we lose every contest with China militarily that gets to that point. And that's why what Congressman Smith said in your earlier interview is very important to stress, which is we do not want to get in a war with China. What we want to do is we need to be able to counteract China and deter them from reckless behavior, from trying to coerce or intimidate our allies in the region, and assert its power in the world in a way that runs counter to our interests. So there's lots of things we need to be doing in terms of our defense capabilities, and that's going to require some really hard decisions, particularly as we're going to be entering an era of defense austerity. I think the defense budget would come under pressure regardless of the pandemic, but it's going to be a much more austere budget environment with the pandemic and the economic crisis that I don't think we've really even seen the beginnings of yet.
Derek, you've worked on both sides of the line of the Defense Department and the State Department. We'll call that the line. We've been talking a little bit today about hard power and soft power, how you deploy them, how you think about them. I remember former Defense Secretary Bob Gates, saying when Secretary Clinton was running the State Department that more defense dollars should be shifted to state because diplomacy is what delivers and matters. That, I mean, despite Mike Pompeo, he started off today's program, that doesn't seem to be where muscle is exhibited. And I'm interested in how you think, when it comes to national security, again, which we're discussing today, how do you get the equities right and how we deploy our national security policy through these bureaucracies, really?
Yeah, Steve, it's very important that you bring that up, and you're right to point out Secretary Gates's very eloquent arguments that he made as Defense Secretary for a larger State Department budget. In fact, we've seen over the last 10 to 20 years, really, as this has been an issue, the most powerful voices calling for more money spent, more resources for diplomacy and development happen to be in the military, because it tends to be the military that then ends up doing the work because of the underfunding of the State Department or USAID or the other elements of U.S. power. And it's interesting, I've been reflecting with the aftermath of the pandemic here and thinking through that we've got, since February of this year, around the world, there's been about 500,000 people killed from COVID-19. And of course, economies have been destroyed. Our lives have been disrupted as never before. And I would posit that there's no conventional power that would have been capable of wreaking that so much havoc and doing so much damage and killing so many people in such a short period of time than this pandemic has. So short of nuclear war, we are seeing a threat to our security like none of us had ever imagined. And I think that has to change the way we think about security. The defense budget, the U.S. defense budget, is still going to remain the largest by the order of magnitude, larger than China's, larger than most of the rest of the world combined. But we're going to need to spend more money to better prepare ourselves for the next public health crisis. And if you think it can't get worse, there's a powerful article today in the Atlantic saying we need to prepare for another pandemic on top of this one. So the idea that we need to invest more in these other elements of U.S. power, I think it's a very, very compelling argument. It's always been compelling, even more so by what people are living through day to day everywhere in the country. This isn't some far off war that seems distant from everyone. This is something we are living with day to day. And it's something that, if not outright preventable, we can certainly mitigate the worst circumstances by investing more in the things that we've shortchanged over the years. And that's going to mean spending a little less on defense. We're still going to have a defense, and we should still have a military that's second to none. I'm confident we will. The challenge is going to be, as you said, these bureaucratic structures, bureaucratic within the executive branch, bureaucratic in terms of the way the Hill does defense budgeting. These are going to be huge challenges for the next administration, certainly a Biden administration, but I would also argue if Trump were to get reelected, these issues aren't going to go away.
Let me give you another really tough question here. It's going to take me a second to carve. But if you were to make Donald Trump, who many people look at as a transactional guy, more of a success in national security and foreign policy than many folks perceive him to be, love to hear it, because I want to tell the audience, they may not know this name well. I recommend that they look at Derek's wonderful book about Richard Holbrooke. We both knew Richard Holbrooke very well. I remember once writing a piece about Richard Holbrooke, who called him the Democrats' perfect amoral man, because he was willing to do a deal with anyone to achieve some great global justice. He would deal with the devil, and did, as he did with Milosevic and others, Slobodan Milosevic and others, to basically stop bombing, stop human rights violations, etc. And so sometimes I sort of feel like that's a missing character out there, is the transactional person willing to deal with all sides to get to a greater place. How would you, so reflecting on what Richard Holbrooke would say today and do today, how could you make Donald Trump better if you had that chance as a success in foreign policy?
Well, maybe let me slightly reframe the question.
Go ahead.
I think it's hard to conjure up how Trump can be a success, because even the things that he does, that he's done, that I, on its face, I don't have a problem with. I mean, talking to your enemies is not in and of itself a bad idea. Of course,
right.
Barack Obama was criticized loudly by, of course, many of the people who support Donald Trump for being willing to talk to some of America's enemies. It's the way you approach that, and the alliance system in which you're embedded within, and the cards that you're bringing to the table. My fault with President Trump's approach to problems like North Korea, the way he's handled some of the trickier relationships we have, Trump problematic relationships we have with countries like Russia and China, is that he's almost too enthusiastic to talk to our adversaries, and he's got nothing in return for it at all. So there is a smart way to do that. And I think it would be unwise for a next administration, if it's a Biden administration, I don't think this would happen, but it would be unwise to say, well, Trump has so thoroughly discredited the idea that America should be confident enough to talk to its enemies that we should never try it. We just need to go about it in a wholly different way. And similarly, I think Trump's reticence to get involved further militarily in the Middle East is something that Barack Obama famously was very worried about getting involved in Syria. The policy that Trump is basically running in Syria and Iraq today is in large part a continuation of the policy that he inherited. I don't necessarily fault him for that. Again, some of the decisions around that fundamental resistance to getting deeper into a place like Syria, for example, pulling the rug out from under the Kurds on no notice, the way he's approached the Iran challenge, I have big problems with, and think we're not in a better place because of that. But I think that basic idea that the U.S., because of challenges like China, cannot afford to spend another decade mired in conflicts in the Middle East, doesn't mean we pull out entirely. It just means we need to be thoughtful about how we're trying to tackle those challenges.
Well, Derek Chollet, Executive Vice President of the German Marshall Fund, it's been a real privilege spending time with you and getting your insights on how the world is working. So thank you so much
Steve,
for joining us.
Always great to be with you, Steve. Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.